Hey, how you doing, guys? It's Doc Vinyl again. Guess who we're doing today? I wonder. Yeah, you guessed it. Traffic. just screwing around with you. Little cappuccino. And a little traffic. Oh, love this tune. Gotta turn it down now so I can do my talk. So yes, today we're going to do Traffic. I kind of mentioned them before in one of the other spotlights when I talked about different music and what have you. But today, on my other videos, today we're going to talk about Traffic, talk about the band members, talk about their formation, and there's a lot of interesting history there. A little, some interesting pedigree, what bands they were in, and what have you. So let's get rolling. Okay. Traffic's formed in 1967 by essentially four members: Steve Winwood, Dave Mason, Jim Capaldi, and Chris Wood. Now, Steve Winwood is the major dominant personality in the band, and of course he came from the Spencer Davis Band earlier in 65 and 66. He was 14, 15 years old with his brother Muff Winwood in that band. Wrote the two major hits and sang them, Give Me Some Lovin' and I'm a Man, which, a lot of success in such an early career. So he leaves Spencer Davis Band in 1967 and forms Traffic. Hooks up with Dave Mason, who had been in a couple other bands, and Jim Capaldi and Chris Wood, and they form the band in 1967. Very interesting, kind of a folky, psychedelic kind of thing going on. Now, where Traffic falls into the categories of what kind of music it is, technically it's considered progressive rock, and it is to a certain degree, but there is some folk characteristics to it and a lot of lyrical aspects to it too, which we'll talk a little about, the technical aspects of music, but not too much, not to bore you. So their first album comes out. It's called Mr. Fantasy. Right here, of course, the shirt, Mr. Fantasy. And big hit. Not a huge hit, but a pretty big hit for a band that kind of, in the background in 1967. Of course, the song Dear Mr. Fantasy is really one of the bigger hits on this. And this album is released on Island. Just a really, really stupendous album, as you can see. Again, I love showing the vinyl because, this is actually what you would have got in 1967. This is a repress, but it's like a 1968-69 repress on Island still, same label. So pretty close to what you would have get. So, and it's from an analog tape, so not one of these vinyls pressed from a CD kind of thing, which, not my thing, but whatever. We won't get into that. Now, this has Steve Winwood on organ and various keyboards and vocals, has Jim Capaldi on drums, percussion, and vocals, Chris Wood on flute, saxophone, organ, and vocals, plays most of the horn instruments, and Dave Mason playing the guitar, some mellotron, some sitar and bass guitar work, and some vocals too. Now, this album really showcases some of the talent of the band. This has Dear Mr. Fantasy on it, which is, of course, one of the big hits. And there's quite a few other songs on it that are pretty good. But the Mr. Fantasy song is written by Dave Mason, so we can start to see the two dominant personalities of the band, Dave Mason and, of course, Steve Winwood, and where it's going to go. Mason has I have to give this to him, he has a knack of writing lyrical songs that were very popular in the late 60s, early 70s. And again, of course, he kind of integrated a lot of psychedelic stuff that was slightly different than what Winwood wanted. So this album's pretty successful. They toured, did really well with it. And this album comes out in 1967. Their next album, self-titled Traffic, comes out in 1968, right here. Again, same lineup, basically, of Winwood, Capaldi, Wood, and Dave Mason. Now, this is where the album, they start to show that Dave Mason and Steve Winwood start to have a clash of personalities. Now, this album's pretty good. You can all join me in it, and it has a big hit that Mason writes that is a hit on this album, but made bigger by Joe Cocker in the early 70s, called Feeling All Right, which is very interesting because this album kind of shows the conflict between Winwood and Mason. Mason writing the lyrical hits and Winwood kind of driving the musical aspects of the band. Again, sort of a problem. Mason temporarily leaves the band here, and when he does, Winwood kind of disbands the band in 1968. But it's an interesting hiatus, and let's talk about that hiatus. He and fellow Traffic member Chris Wood, who was playing a lot of the Woodwood instruments, joined up with a guitarist you might have heard of. His name was Jimi Hendrix, and they played on the Electric Ladyland album in 1968, and they did some session work, and it was very interesting because they were from Traffic, and of course their contributions to the album are pretty important. A lot of the organ work that's on it is Steve Winwood playing with Jimi Hendrix. Cool stuff. Don't get me wrong, which is pretty cool. Let me just adjust this a little bit. Sorry. And that's interesting. So he comes back in 1968, early 69, and they decide to form together. And again, the third album comes out, and the third album is called Last Exit, with the traffic symbol on it. And again, this is the same band members of the four that I talked about before, but this is really the last studio album that Dave Mason's going to appear on. Now, this has a couple of good songs on it, but you can see the conflict between Winwood and Mason coming to a head. Now, one of the big songs on this is Medicated Goo, one of my favorites. I kind of like it. It's kind of a cool song, especially when what's going on nowadays. You know, Just For You on this. Something Got a Hold on My Toe, which is kind of weird. It's kind of a cool psychedelic song. But as you can see, this has definitely got some psychedelic in it. Side 2's got Feeling Good. It's got Grease Paint and Blind Man. Again, all written kind of interestingly, but we see a split between the Winwood and Winwood Capaldi camp versus Mason. And Mason finally leaves the band for any more studio albums. This is the last studio album that Dave Mason will appear on. So, and that's 1969. Now, here's an interesting part. When Mason finally leaves the band again after this album, Steve Winwood takes a hiatus and joins another band. Now, here again, where the pedigree comes in. He had played with Jimi Hendrix. Now, guess what happens? Steve Winwood joins up with a friend of his that he met named Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker, who just left the band called Cream, and they formed a supergroup of the supergroups, supergroup from the supergroup of supergroups, the supergroup of all supergroups, Blind Faith, which we're all quite familiar with their lexicon. Great music, great stuff, but it was a one-shot hit, one-shot deal. And Winwood plays on it in 1969, Blind Faith with a great Can't Find My Way Home, and a bunch of other great songs. Just a really good album. I'll talk about that in another episode when we talk about one-album bands, which are kind of few. Derek and the Dominoes is another one, of course, Eric Clapton. But again, let's not go down that road. That's another rabbit hole we can go down in another day. So he does the Blind Faith kick. They break up, and then he reforms. He's going to write a solo album. So he figures, hey, I'm going to go do a solo album. So Steve Winwood goes to do a solo album, hooks up with Jim Capaldi, and then Chris Wood's in tow. So all of a sudden, he's got most of Traffic right there. And they form Traffic again. And in 1970, come out with a blockbuster of a hit. And of course, we all know, John Barleycorn Must Die. John Barleycorn Must Die was really one of their really, really stupendous instrumental albums. Of course, I was playing Glad and Freedom Rider before this. You know, that was what you listened to when I introed. This is an amazing album. And this is a power trio of Jim Capaldi, Steve Winwood, and Chris Wood. And this has just got lots of great hits. It's got Glad and Freedom Rider on it, which you heard is so great. Empty Pages is really good, sung by Jim Capaldi. Stranger to Himself, John Barleycorn, which a traditional arrangement by Winwood, and Every Mother's Son by Winwood and Capaldi with a lot of woodwinds by Chris Wood. Amazing album. This is probably one of the best-selling, I would say. I think it's probably one of the best-selling. I didn't do the research. Sorry, guys. I should have. But I think this is one of the best-selling Traffic albums. But again, we'll talk about when I rank my favorites and whatever. And it's my rankings going to be a little bit different than everyone else's, obviously. Great album. This put Traffic back on the map. They started touring. They did really well. No Dave Mason. Now, but Dave Mason does show up again. But how does Dave Mason show up again? He has a contractual agreement with the record company. So they put out a live album called Welcome to the Canteen. And this is interesting because this album brings back Dave Mason only temporarily, but also introduces some new members. And of course, this is Welcome to the Canteen. It's a live album, very good. And I don't generally do live albums with this, but I think it's important to understand the evolution of the band. And some of these members go on to become regular members for the next couple of albums. So that's why I think evolutionary, it makes sense to go over this album. There is another one, Traffic on the Road, which is a great album too. And like I said, I don't generally do live albums. I do like them, but that's a whole other kick. This includes Steve Winwood, Jim Capaldi, Dave Mason back again to write a couple songs, Chris Wood, Rick Grech, and Rebop Kawakbaha, who is Ghana, from Ghana. He's a great percussionist, and Jim Gordon. Great band. Jim Gordon, of course, from Derek and the Dominoes, which is very interesting. In 1971, he leaves Derek and the Dominoes, which, of course, was the one album wonder from Eric Clapton. This album is really good. It's a live album. It's a mixed bag of a couple things, and there's a couple interesting notes I want to make about this. Now, this really shows a new lineup of Traffic forming with Dave Mason leaving. This includes Medicated Goo, again from Last Exit, one of my favorite songs, Sad and Deep as You, 40,000 Headmen, Shouldn't Have Been Taken More Than You Gave, which I think is kind of a nick towards Steve Winwood, but I don't know exactly from Dave Mason. Then Dear Mr. Fantasy, which of course is from their first album, and then of course Give Me Some Lovin' is the track out. Now Give Me Some Lovin' is interesting. It's a Spencer Davis hit, of course, that's Winwood wrote, a big hit, and everyone loved it. If you listen to this, that's why I love vinyl, guys. When you listen to this, what is interesting is they're playing two counterpoint melodies, which is weird. It's obviously a personality conflict here. So Steve Winwood's playing his do 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 do, give me some love, the song the way it goes, and Dave Mason's playing something completely different, and it's like they're playing together. It's a cacophony of sound. It's weird. And it goes on for 8 minutes. So it's weird, and it's almost like they're battling back and forth on the instruments. Who's going to get what? And the song is supposed to be Give Me Some Lovin', but Dave Mason is not conceding whatever. And this is it. He's gone. After this album, he plays this album because of contractual agreements, and I think he and Winwood just did not see on different level. So, that comes out after John Barleycorn Must Die. Then the next album comes out, one of my personal favorites. And that album, of course, is Low Spark of High Heel Boys. Look at the psychedelic, the way it's cut. So cool. Again, that's the reason why I love vinyl. And then this album, again, on the lineup of Steve Winwood, Jim Capaldi, Reebok, Rick Greck, and others, the band members start to congeal a little bit. And it's, again, the focus is on really the three members that really become the focus of the band because they change. Hawkins comes in on the next album, which you'll see, is Steve Winwood, Jim Capaldi, and Reebok Capo. They all stay together, and then they change bass players and guitarists and various horn players and what have you. But this album is just a powerhouse of an album. This has Hidden Treasure, which opens up really nice, great keyboards, and then one of my personal favorites, a Low Spark of High Heel Boys. Amazing. Light Up or Leave Me Alone, another great song sung by Jim Capaldi. Really, really good. Nice different counterpoint to Steve Winwood's voice. Side 2's got Rock and Roll Stew. Excellent guitar work. Many a Mile to Freedom. Very good. And finishes off with Rainmaker. Again, very solid album. A little different direction that Traffic was going into, but very good. Solid keyboards, great percussion work, layered melodic level of playing. This really showed a little bit more sophistication than the earlier Traffic. It kind of showed what John Barleycorn Must Die was going to, and then came to this. So we can kind of see the back-to-back studio albums where different from Dave Mason. Now, and of course, this album's released in 1971. Okay, so Low Spark of High Heel Boys is 1971, and it's right after the Welcome to the Canteen. Now, the next album that comes out is Shootout at Fantasy Factory, and this comes out 2 years after. Again, the same kind of die cut here to kind of maintain, and again, this is a different lineup here. Good stuff, but the core is still there. Jim Capaldi, Steve Winwood, and Reebok Kawakabaha. They're the three that are the majors. Then we have a new David Hood who comes in, plays some bass and what have you. Roger Hawkins, and then Chris Wood comes back to play, which is very interesting too, to do some horn work. This is a really, really potent album. This has Shootout at Fantasy Factory, which is a really big hit and one of their favorites played live. This has Roll Right Stones, Evening Blue, and then finishes off with Tragic Magic. These are longer instrumental songs. A little bit more proggy, more percussion-driven. Very cool stuff, and some really, really good songwriting, I think, personally, and some great musicmanship by Steve Winwood. Great album. And this is really the last of the great albums, because then after this, in 1974 comes their last album I consider, and I'll talk about the last one too, is Traffic When the Eagle Flies. And this is a really good album. This, again, hones it down to the four members, again, with Steve Winwood, Capaldi, Reebok, Bukahu, and Rick Greck. Now, this is a really, really good album in some ways, and in other ways, it's Walking in the Wind is good, and Something's New is good, and Memories of Rock and Rolla are really good. And then there's a couple others, like When the Eagle Flies is a little weak of a song. We can start to see the band is not having that chemistry it had earlier. And this is really a swan song of what they were. It's a decent effort, I have to admit. It's the last real true Traffic effort, but it's just not really the, it's really not the elements that we can understand what Traffic's all about. Now, the last album I'm going to talk about, and I don't have it, and I'm not even going to bother because it's just not really a Traffic album. It's called Far From Home. It comes out 20 years after that one I just did in 1994. It's just basically a Steve Winwood solo album, I think, personally. It's not bad. It's just, Jim Capaldi happens to be on it. No other members of Traffic. So to me, it's a lot of people agree it's really not a Traffic album as we know it. All right? So that's Traffic for you in a nutshell. Now, gonna do my ranking, and then we'll close it all off. See what you guys say. Now, you may not agree with my ranking. Again, in the comment section, and when you subscribe, please do subscribe. And in your comment section, write what you think. Do you agree? Steve, you're crazy. Doc Violet, you're a crazy guy. That's not the best, whatever. But again, these are my personal favorites, and I'm going to go through them from least to best. Okay. Now, I'm not even going to do Far From Home, so that's not even though technically it's a Traffic album, but if it was, that would be definitely the worst. Now, obviously, you kind of get a lay of the land as I went over them, where I'm going to go. Now, my least favorite album in this little duet is, of course, When the Eagles Fly. This I thought was a weaker album. This is kind of showing the fissures of Traffic, kind of like, seeing what's going on, and leaving the elements of Traffic behind. And this is, again, it's not a bad album, but it's weak. It's not as strong as their earlier efforts. Okay. Next up for the bids is Last Exit. Last Exit is a decent album. I like Medicated Goo, but that's about it. This really highlights the Dave Mason, Steve Winwood fissure. And I didn't, you can see it on this album. It's a decent album, but not the best. And you could see they're distracted because after this album, Winwood goes on to Blind Faith, Mason leaves and comes back. And then, so it's really kind of a crazy thing going on. So this album is again, it doesn't congeal as best, okay, as I think. So again, this is one of the, not my favorite albums. So, okay. Now, coming down to the next one is, of course, their second album, their self-titled Traffic. Now, this is a decent album. I like it, but again, it's got Feeling All Right on it. It's got a couple of good songs, but again, you can still see that kind of fusion between Mason and Winwood. This is good, but not as good as their first album. Okay, I do like this album. It's decent. It's got decent songs on it, but I can really see some of the issues that we have with the band on this one. So again, that's next one there. And then as we get down to the bottom levels here, now we're going to start getting into it. I'm going to put the Canteen album because of the discorded music between Dave Mason and Steve Winwood, which is kind of weird. But otherwise, it's kind of interesting because I like the fact that we're introducing new players in here, and it starts on the live version, and then they go into the studio with them. So really, really cool stuff there. I do like the fact that they do Give Me Some Lovin', which I love. And it's an interesting version, actually. It's pretty cool. Medicated Goo, they do a great live version of that. And so this is a pretty solid album for a live album and for the previews of coming attractions about the new members. That's why I liked it. Okay. Now we're getting into the last four. I'm going to go with Shootout at Fantasy Factory. Again, I like this album. I think it's a solid album. It's got some great songs on it, but just not as strong as the next three. The top three they're pretty close too, and we'll talk about that. So this one's pretty good. Shootout at Fantasy Factory. And then the next one I'm going to have to go with is, it's a tough one here, but I'm probably going to go with, John Barleycorn Must Die. Now, I love this album, don't get me wrong, and this is a lot of people's favorite album, but I consider it number 3. But again, on a given day, it could be number 2, it could even be number 1. You never know, things change. But again, this is a really good album. I like it. It really focuses on the new band, or the trio. Glad and Freedom Fighter are really good. John Barleycorn's okay. Some of the other songs are a little weaker tracks, but it's good, and the instrumentation is really good, so I do like it a lot. Now, that leads me to my last two. Number 2 is Traffic's first album. I like this one a lot. Dear Mr. Fantasy is really cool. It's got that nice 60s feel to it. It's really fresh and raw. You can tell that they're together for the first time and they really want to make a creative impetus of some sort of music. Good stuff. Like it a lot. Songs on this are really solid. Pretty good stuff. I like it a lot. And then, of course, my favorite album, which is interesting because it's a completely different band than this first album, is, of course, Low Sparket High Heel Boys. This one, I think, is top to bottom one of their best albums. I love the lineup. I know it doesn't have Dave Mason in it, and I do like some of the Dave Mason material that he did, but this one is just my favorite album. This is just really good. I mean, I love Low Sparket High Heel Boys, Light Up or Leave Me Alone. The guitar's awesome. Rainmaker's really good, and Rock and Roll Stew. This has the most songs that I love. I love the style of it. I love the percussion. And live, this is amazing. I love Low Sparket High Heel Boys live on the road. Really good. So, all right, so recap here. I'm going to go with quick recap. Number 1, Low Sparket High Heel Boys. Number 2, Dear Mr. Fantasy. Number 3, John Barleycorn Must Die. I love that. Cool stuff. Number 4, Shootout at Fantasy Factory. Again, the cut. Love it. And then that leaves us with number 5. Welcome to the Canteen. Live album, but again, displaying the first new members. Number 6, Traffic's second album, self-titled, with the Dave Mason. And number 7 is Last Exit. All right. And number 8 is When the Eagle Flies. Okay, so there we go. So that's Traffic for you. I hope you guys agree or not. Let me know what you guys think. And while we're in this quarantine, I hope you guys are doing some auctions. We're going to hopefully do some Traffic material on the new auctions on Record Hub with Max J Records and John. Hope everything's going all right. I left a message there. I'll see you guys on Record Hub. And I'll love to hear some comments on YouTube. So please subscribe. Get some comments in there, and let's see what's going on. I love to hear what's going on with you guys, and give me some votes on what bands you want me to cover next. So, all right. So for now, signing off. Take it easy. It's Doc Vinyl.